All right, good morning, everybody. Hey, can we just give Josh a huge round of applause, actually, instead of a golf clap? We were just talking about this in the previous series. Josh, I don't even know how old Josh is. He's like 20 years old or something like that. Like, it just goes to show you manhood is not a product of your age, but there was a young man, right? Hey, one thing real quickly, too. Our church plant, Portrait Church, their team is with us today. They're going to be having their grand opening next week. And so we're going to be praying for them in just a little bit. At the end of this, would you also give them a huge round of applause as well? I think it's appropriate for me to talk about this. Long time ago in a galaxy far away, I was a part of a church plant, and I never wanted to do that again. You know, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, setting up 500 chairs for 8 people to be there. 5 of those are my family members. No, thank you. I wasn't going to do that. And so I went to go be the young adult pastor at the largest church I had ever been a part of, okay? They had 2 acres of land. They were 300 to 400 people. I thought I had died and gone to heaven at that point. When after about 2 years, the senior pastor came up to me and asked me if I wanted to plant a church with him. And I said, let me think about that. Heck no, I don't want to do that. Because back then, the only reason why a senior pastor came to you in order for the associate to go and plant a church is because he wanted to get rid of him. I was like, no way am I leaving. One day I'm going to have 5 babies and they're going to need insurance. And so I am not leaving this place. But then all of a sudden I started doing some of the apologetics of church planting, or why it is that we need to plant new churches. And I don't know if you know this, but in North America, 80 to 85% of churches are in plateau or decline. Every week, we are net losing more churches than we are gaining. Do you know what both of those statistics mean? Both of those statistics mean this, that the physical manifestation of the kingdom of God is actually dying and taking a step back in North America. I don't know if you know this, but all over the world, Christianity is thriving. All over the world, there is revival that is going on. In India, 16,000 people a day are coming to know the Lord. In China, 22,000 people are coming to know the Lord every day. Christianity is in revival, except for 2 places. Do you know where that is? Europe and North America. And then all of a sudden, I saw it. I saw a quote from C. Peter Wagner, famous missiologist, that said this, that the most effective way of reaching an unchurched person for Christ is, you know what? The planting of new churches. And so I went to the pastor and I said, hey, I kind of feel like maybe God is calling me to do this, and I just want to hear God's confirmation through you. So he was like, 16 years ago, he said, let's go ahead and do this. So we had our first service. It was like 220 people came to it. We had a grand opening. 353 people were there. Back in the early days when you were a church planter, you knew every single person that came because you counted pets as 1 and pregnant women as 2. Okay, I had never seen that many people baptized in my entire life. And so after about a year of that, man, we wanted to keep the fire going. We wanted to keep the mojo going. And so we hired a guy to come out to do a strategic one day with our staff. And, after that entire day, he excused the staff and he just met with me. And he went, you know what, Mark? Wow, there are so many great things happening at Vantage Point. And I said, yes, there are so many great things happening at Vantage Point. He said, man, Mark, you are so blessed to be the pastor of this church. And I said, absolutely. I am so blessed to be the pastor of this church. Then he asked me this question. He said, Mark, but how are you doing? And I said, I am doing awful. Because it was at that moment I felt like the pressure to perform and the pressure to succeed was already starting to break me. And we were only 400 people back then. You know what's interesting, and I really do receive this as a compliment, honestly. There are a lot of people who will come up to me saying, you know what, Mark, man, I wish you would speak every weekend. Or they would say this, you know what, Mark, I wish we didn't have to see you on video, and I wish you could speak live every service. And you know what, I receive that as such an encouragement and such a compliment, because what y'all are saying is this, that I love having you as my pastor, and I love being your pastor. However, let me tell you what it's like a little bit to be on stage, and it's this feeling right here. It's intoxicating to be on stage. And let me tell you why. Because when you're on stage as a pastor, I want you to think about my job for a second. I represent God. I am God's voice. You know, to a certain extent, I am the bridge between heaven and earth. And so when the lights are on and the mic is hot, it's an intoxicating feeling. But can anybody tell me what the root word of intoxication is? It's actually this right here. It's that, in other words, the more somebody is in the public eye, what you're going to find is that the toxicity level in that person starts to rise a little bit. What you're going to find is that that's the case with politicians, that's the case with celebrities, anybody who is in the public eye for some pastors are actually blindsided by this, because anybody who is in the public eye for very long, what you're going to find is that the toxicity level inside of them begins to rise, and it begins to rise, and it begins to rise, because after a while, what you're going to find is that person begins to believe the press about themselves. That maybe they are really that important. That maybe they really are that irreplaceable. And here's the thing. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not just trying to talk about my job. What I'm trying to say, honestly, is this, that you feel this probably to a certain extent too. Do you know why? Because ever since the invention of social media, I would say this, that there is absolutely nothing that is private about our lives anymore. Right? That everything is in the public eye, that everything is open to public scrutiny, that everything. And because of that, we all kind of feel like we have to get every decision right, and that everything in our lives has to be perfect. I almost kind of feel sorry for high school kids these days. You know why? Because when I was in high school, we didn't have social media. And so, I didn't really know if the other kids liked me or not. But now high school kids have quantifiable proof when nobody cares about them. And they look at their Instagram and they go, how come I only got 5 likes? I want you to think about this for a second. We live in the land of Southern California, don't we? This is the land of public appearance. This is the place where you feel the pressure to succeed. You feel the pressure to look a certain way. You feel the pressure to drive a certain car, to have your kids be a certain type of kid, to have your clothes be a certain style. I mean, for goodness sake, Hollywood is not that far away, right? They shoot films in Hollywood. They shoot TV shows in Orange County. I mean, in Riverside County, I'm pretty sure that they only shoot people, but, still, this is the land of outward appearance, and we feel this pressure to get everything right. Here's a cycle of performance that we all feel enslaved by, and maybe you feel enslaved by it too. There's ambition that leads to drive that ultimately results in exhaustion. Anybody feeling this? Anybody? Anyone exhausted from trying to succeed? Is anybody exhausted from trying to keep up with that perfect Orange County mom on Instagram? Oh, I hate you. I mean, this is part of the reason why you want to quit your job. This is part of the reason why you want to self-medicate until you can't see straight. This is part of the reason why maybe some of you even want to take your lives. And let me tell you this. This is not the life that Jesus wants for you. That Jesus wants something totally, totally different for you. If you have your Bibles, why don't you turn to Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 39. If you have your Vantage Point app, you can even turn to that verse and that. Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 39. It says this right here. Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 39. It says this right here. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark. What I'd love to do is I want to pause there for a second because one of the good Bible techniques is to make sure that you're looking for phrases that are repeated throughout the Bible, and in particular, when a phrase is repeated by a certain author. We're in Mark chapter 1, which is obviously in the beginning of Mark, but book ended at the end of Mark in Mark chapter 16. What you'll find is a phrase that is very similar to this phrase. Do you know where I'm going with this? You know where I'm going with this? Mark chapter 16 at the very end says this, very early in the morning, just after sunrise, what is it that happens? Can anybody tell me? Jesus is resurrected from the dead. And so here's what I want you to know, that many times we want the life of Jesus, but we're not willing to live the lifestyle of Jesus. And what the Bible wants to tell us is this, that if you want to experience resurrection, then what you and I have to do is you and I have to engage in the practice of Jesus. And what is it that he does in Mark chapter 1 that is indicative of this? Let's go back and read it. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, he left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Verse 36, Simon and his companions went to look for him. They were always looking for him. Where in the world is this Jesus? He's always like, we can't find him. My kids are always saying this. Where's mom? Where's mom? Where's mom? You know, she's hiding from you, okay? Now, Jesus wasn't hiding from the disciples, but he was always just off to be with the Father. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Oh, yeah? Okay. I don't care. Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, now, we're in a series called Deep Faith right now, and here's what we've been talking about. There's a difference between what we would call a deep fake and a deep faith. Okay? That there's a difference between a deep fake and a deep faith. And what we've been saying is this, that a deep faith is not somebody who simply says that they believe in God. That a deep faith is not somebody that a follower of Jesus, believe it or not, okay, this may be surprising news. Are you ready for it? That a follower of Jesus is actually somebody who follows Jesus. Somebody who follows in the lifestyle, somebody who follows in the practice, and somebody who imitates the lifestyle of Jesus. Here's what we talked about last week, and I think Dallas Willard, the Master Yoda, I think put it best. And this is going to be the structure for our series. Okay, Dallas Willard says this right here. A disciple of Jesus, or a Christian in other words, is someone who is with him, learning to be like him, and who intends to do and say what Jesus would say and do in a manner in which he would say and do it. So in other words, that a Christian is somebody who wants to spend time with him. A Christian is somebody who wants to be like him. And a Christian ultimately is somebody who wants to obey him. That if God's desires and my desires conflict, guess whose desires I want more? That I want to obey him. So here's what we want to do first of all. We want to talk about the first element of that definition, and that is this, that a Christian or a disciple of Jesus is someone who is with him. That in other words, that when you become a Christian, that you didn't just get religion, as some people say, but that you got a relationship. That you entered into what the Bible calls a covenant relationship. Do you know what the closest thing to that is? The closest thing to that is marriage. When you said, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. And here's the thing. If I got married to my wife and I spent absolutely no time with her, guess what kind of a relationship that would be? That would be a non-existent one. or that would be a very, very bad one at that. In other words, here's what it is that we're trying to talk about, that this, at the end of the day, is not simply an instruction book, but this, at the end of the day, is the greatest love story that you will ever read. Do you know why? Because in the very beginning of this Bible, it actually starts with a wedding where Adam and Eve come together, and Adam looks at Eve for the first time, and he breaks out in poetry. And he says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. Believe it or not, this book does not end with a cataclysmic apocalypse, but it actually ends with a wedding ceremony of Jesus and his church coming back together. That the climax of this book is that Jesus, as the jilted lover, just will not give up on his true love, and so must pursue her until the very point of sacrificing his own life for you and for me. In fact, just a couple days before his death, he actually says this right here in John chapter 15, verse 9. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Would you all read this with me? So remain in my love. So let's spend time together. Because we love each other, let's talk with one another. That's what I want most from you. That, in other words, that the antidote to the exhaustion that we feel in this world is not to get rid of drive. It's not to get rid of ambition. But in other words, that the antidote to the exhaustion that you feel in the public eye is to actually get with Jesus in the private place. Does that make sense? Because at the end of the day, how do you know you're in love with somebody? You know that you're in love with somebody when you want to spend time with them. When Andrea and I, when we were first newlyweds, they practically had to kick us out of the restaurant because all we wanted to do is sit there and talk with one another. You know, this is the stage in our relationship in old age that Andrea and I can't wait to get to, believe it or not, and that is this. Have you ever seen this when you see an older couple in a restaurant and they're not even talking to each other? Have you ever seen that? Like, I've gone to Andrea before and gone, that is so pathetic. And she's like, I don't think that's pathetic at all. And I'm like, oh, yeah, me too, right. I don't think that's pathetic. Like, why do I think that's not pathetic? And she says, because look at them. They're connecting without even talking. But here's what I'm trying to say. Do you know what the hardest time to communicate is? The hardest time to communicate as a couple is sometime between the newlywed stage and old age. Because staying in love while you're paying bills and changing diapers and getting kids off to Little League and building your career, that's not only difficult on a marriage, that's doubly difficult on your relationship with God. But can I tell you this? It's the middle years. That's where love is either won or it's lost. And Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, so remain in my love. If we go back to Mark chapter 1, what we find is that Jesus calls his first disciples. And Jesus is just immediately in the thick of it. He is preaching and he is teaching in the morning. In the afternoon, Jesus and his disciples make a house call for Peter's sick mother-in-law. Not a bad first day, right? This is Jesus's first day on the job as the Savior of the world. And so you would think at this point, it's like, hey, let's chill out. Let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings. Let's grab some dinner, and everybody, it's been a really full day, but we actually find that his day gets worse after this. Verse 33 and 34 says this right here, that the whole town gathered at the door. Can you imagine that? Sometimes it's hard for me to get like a couple prayer requests, let alone all of Eastvale coming to my door. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons. So Jesus, after a busy day, he is just working all night. And you would think to yourself that Jesus would say, okay, come on, everybody. Like, man, has that been a productive first day. So here's what we're going to do. Don't set your alarm clocks in the morning. We're just going to sleep in. We're going to go grab some brunch at Scrambler's Cafe afterwards. Everybody, hey, great first day. Is that what we see in Jesus' life? It's actually not. Because in verse 35, it says this right here. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. And just in case you're wondering, what you're going to find is that this isn't the only time Jesus did this. What we find in the life of Jesus and in the Gospels is that Jesus did this over and over and over and over again. In case you don't believe me, Luke chapter 5 says this, news about him spread all the more, so the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often what? Withdrew to solitary places and prayed. Luke chapter 9 verse 28 says this, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him, and he went up to a mountain to do what? To pray. Matthew chapter 14. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he dismissed them, he went up into the mountainside by himself to pray. Here's my favorite one, Luke chapter 6, verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and guess what? He didn't just pray, but he prayed all night long. When was the last time that you and I prayed all night long? Matthew chapter 26 says this, Jesus went with his disciples to the place called Gethsemane, the place called Pressed Olives. This is the place where Jesus himself would be pressed, right? Jesus went with his disciples to the place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit there while I go over here and pray. Haddon Robinson has a famous quote as it results, as it pertains to Jesus' time in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says this right here. Where was it that Jesus sweat great drops of blood? Or in other words, what he's asking is this, where was it that Jesus prayed most fervently? Where was it that Jesus cried out most desperately to God? He says this, it wasn't in Pilate's hall. It wasn't on his way to Golgotha. It was actually in the Garden of Gethsemane. There he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And I love this part. Had I been there and witnessed that struggle, I don't know if I would have hired him. I would have actually worried about the future. Because if Jesus is all broken up when all he's doing is praying, I might have said, what's this chump going to do when he faces a real crisis? Because all he's doing is sitting there with his two friends, and his two friends are falling asleep. Why can't he approach the ordeal with a calm confidence of his three sleeping friends? And yet this is his conclusion. Ready? Yet when the test came, Jesus walked to the cross with courage, while his three friends fell apart and fell away. In other words, oftentimes what you and I want to do is we want to pray during the crisis, and what we would have found in Jesus' life is that it would have been too late. Jesus was prayed up for the crisis, instead of praying during the crisis. And yet oftentimes what we find in our lives is that we don't really pray all that much until the crisis comes, and then we wonder where God is through all of it. Psalm chapter 27, David is in a crisis. And what does he say? He says this right here: "The Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Now, again, I mentioned this a little bit last week, but you and I have a tendency to think that when David is writing his Psalms, he's writing it in the palace. He's enjoying an Americano. He's like, somebody get me another peeled grape because I feel like I'm inspired. I just need to write Psalm 27. And yet what we find is that that is not the case, because his own son wants to kill him. In fact, if we go on, it says this: "When the wicked advance against me to devour me," and who is that person? His own son. It says this: "Though an army besiege me." Again, I feel a little bit discouraged when I get too many emails. You know, he has an army coming against him at this point. He says this: "Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear." And why will my heart not fear? Because I have dwelt in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. In other words, what we're trying to say here is that there's a difference between a deep fake and a deep faith, right? That a deep faith isn't somebody, that a deep fake is just somebody who looks like a Christian. A deep fake is somebody who calls themselves maybe a Christian. Maybe they even hold a 90-pound Bible and they eat at Chick-fil-A every week. What we find is that a deep faith is actually something that is completely, totally different. A deep faith doesn't even necessarily have to call themselves a Christian. They don't even have to tell you. Do you know why? Because they live it. They can stare adversity. They can stare circumstance. They can stare the election straight in the eyes. And do you know what they're going to feel? They're going to feel nothing but peace and patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. Have you ever met somebody like that? Have you ever met somebody like that? Have you ever met somebody who, you know, their life has pretty much played out like a country music song? You know what I'm saying? Like, they lost their dog. They lost their truck. They lost their belt buckle. And yet that person just draws from a deeper well than you do. Do you know why? It's because that person spends time with God. That the way that they avoid the exhaustion that comes from the public eye is that they get into the private place with God. And what we're going to find is that history actually shows us this over and over and over and over again. Because do you know how it is that the early church defeated the Roman Empire? Do you know how it is that the early church brought down the Roman Empire? You know what the Romans loved? The Romans loved a grisly death. They didn't want to go quickly. They wanted to go slowly. They wanted it to be gruesome. They wanted it to be bloody. And all of a sudden, do you know what they saw? They saw Christians being carted out into the Colosseum. Women and children being draped in animal skins, torn apart by lions. And if you read the account of the martyrs, which I would love for you to do, what you will find is that even the Romans looked at that situation. And they said, from whence do those women and children get that kind of courage? Because what you'll find is that the women were unrelenting. That the children were immovable. And the answer to that question is that the reason why they could have that kind of courage in the public place, you know why? Is because they first wrestled with God in the private place. And you might think to yourself, well, that was something that just happened back then. That's not really something that happens right now. You know what? Let me correct you. Because the Berlin Wall and communism fell because enough people got into the hiding place, and then God released a power that went out into the public place. I would love for you to read the stories about how communist China is having difficulty with the underground church. And it's not because they're hiding. It's because they are getting into the hiding place with God. There's a wonderful book that I'd love for you to read sometime. It's called Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. And it's written about Hudson Taylor. And here is the question that everyone wanted to know. Where does Hudson Taylor get that kind of power? He is the one who actually started China Inland Mission. He saw a generation of Chinese dying without Jesus. And here's what everybody knew about Hudson Taylor, that he worked from day until night. And everybody thought, where does Hudson Taylor get that secret power from? And in the book, his daughter tells a story about how they were in this inn in China. They would sleep on mats on the floor. And one morning, she said this. She said, I saw my father at 2 a.m. wake up, just get a little light and set his Bible on a little table in the corner and spent 2 hours abiding in the love of Jesus in the middle of the night. She said, you want to know what Hudson Taylor's spiritual secret was? That was Hudson Taylor's spiritual secret. It was the fact that Hudson Taylor, that he was always getting into the private place with God. And Jay, if I could have you come up for a second. One of the things